at the end of chapter 14 in the book of Job, Job has finished up the first round of debates with his so-called friends. Moving into chapter 15, Job now begins a second round of debates with his three friends. Once again, we start with Eliaphz. In chapter 15, Eliaphz, the Temanite, once again speaks up. And he says to Job, beginning with verse 2, "Would a wise man answer with empty notions?" In other words, Eliaphz says to Job, everything you have said to us is nothing more than an empty wind. Your arguments have no merit. They're empty and useless. And that proves that, Job, you are not a wise man. In verse 3, he goes on, he says, "Would a wise man argue with useless words? With speeches that do no good?" He says, "You have undermined piety, and you have hindered devotion to God." Now first, we need to ask, whose piety is Eliaphz referring to? Well, he's referring to his own understanding of religion. His own belief in retribution theology, that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Again, this is the teaching that the book of Proverbs puts forth. Eliaphz's concern is that Job is doing away with the teaching of Eliaphz's belief. Job is doing away with fear of God by asking too many questions and by accusing God of harming him unjustly. Eliaphz continues with verse 5. He says, "Job, your sin is what is prompting your mouth to speak. And you have adopted a tongue that is crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, not mine, and your own lips testify against you." According to Eliaphz, Job's foolish, empty, no good talk is an indicator that he is an evil man. For only evil people would speak this way about God. He goes on and he asks, "Are you the first man to ever be born? Were you brought forth before the hills? Do you listen in on God's counsel? Do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know, Job, that we don't? What insights do you have that we do not?" How many times do we behave like Eliaphz? If I'm going to be honest and truthful, I know I behave like Eliaphz. When other people try to point the finger and tell me I'm wrong, my defenses go up. And I respond, well, I know things too. Eliaphz asked Job, "What do you know that we do not?" The answer is that God does not always choose to operate with a retribution theology purpose. God's justice is defined deeper than our understanding of rewards and punishments. That's what Job has learned, that his friends have yet to realize. Jumping down to verse 12, Eliaphz asks, "Why has your heart carried you away? And why do your eyes flash so that you vent your rage against God and pour out such words from your mouth?" In other words, he says, Job, you've turned your spirit from God. Why? Why would you do that? He goes on and he keeps asking, what is man that he can be pure? Or one born of a woman that he could be righteous? If God places no trust in his holy ones, if even the heavens are not pure in his eyes, how much less a man who is vile and abominable and corrupt, who drinks up evil like water. In other words, Job, all along you have been arguing that you are a righteous, innocent, blameless man. But even God's holy ones, which are far superior than you, Job, are not blameless. So how can you continue to say you are innocent? Job, you're a vile, abominable, corrupt person. What a wonderful counselor Eliaphz is. He says to him in verse 17, listen to me, and I will explain to you. Let me tell you what I have seen, what wise men have declared. Eliaphz is including himself with wise men, not with Job, because Job is empty and no good. He says in verse 20, all the days of the wicked man, he suffers torment. The ruthless through all the years have torment stored up for him. Terrifying sounds fill his ears when all seems well. Marauders attack him. He despairs of escaping the darkness. He is marked for the sword. He wanders about, food for vultures. He knows the day of darkness is at hand. Distress and anguish fill him with terror. They overwhelm him like a king poised to attack. What has Job argued so far? The terrors of God horrify him. He has been marked by God. God is shooting his poison arrows into him. And Eliaphz says, this is because you are a wicked man, Job. That is why you are being terrified. That is why you are being attacked. That is why you are nothing more than food for vultures. Because, and he says this in verse 25, because, Job, you have shaken your fist at God. You have vaulted yourself against the Almighty. You have defied him. You have charged him with a thick, strong shield. God is harming you, Job, because you first harmed God. And you think more of yourself than you should. That's what he's saying to Job. You've shaken your fist at God. You think, Job, you have the strength to pick up a shield and fight against the Almighty? He continues in verse 27. Though his face is covered with fat and his waist bulges in the flesh, he will inhabit ruined towns and houses where no one lives, houses crumbling to rubble. This is a reference to what happened to Job's children in chapter 1. He will no longer be rich, and his wealth will no longer endure, nor will his possessions spread over the land. Again, a reference to all that had been stolen away from Job in the opening chapters. Now, Eliaphz says to Job, there is no escape. He says, you will not escape the darkness. A flame will wither your shoots, and the breath of God's mouth will carry you away. Let him not deceive himself by trusting what is worthless, for he will get nothing in return. Before his time, he will be paid in full, and his branches will not flourish. He will be like a vine stripped of its unique grapes, and an olive tree shedding its blossoms. For the company of the godless will be barren, and fire will consume the tents of those who love bribes. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil. Their womb fashions deceit. What Eliaphz concludes is that it is Job who has become the monster that must be destroyed. And so he says, Job, you had your chance to repent. All three of us, referring to Job's friends, all three of us have tried to show you that you are a wicked, sinful man. And if you would admit that, if you would ask for God's forgiveness, God, who is merciful, would withdraw his terrors and forgive you. But Job, you've refused to do that. And so now, Job, there's no escape. You've reached a point of no return. You are a monster, and God will destroy you. Job responds in chapter 16. He says, opening up with verse 2, I have heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all. And is that not the truth? Will your long-winded speeches never end? Ironically, Job's speeches are 3 times as long as his friends. He says, what ails you that you keep arguing? Well, the answer is Job's presence himself keeps them arguing. He says, I also could speak like you if you were in my place. In other words, if you were the one being terrified by God, I could act and say the wrong things like you are doing, but I wouldn't do that. I could make fine speeches against you and shake my head and point my finger at you, but my mouth would encourage you. He says, if the roles were reversed, I would not be such a fair weather friend. I would be a true and honest comforter. Verse 6, he says, yet if I speak, my pain is not relieved. So basically, what's the point? And if I refrain, it does not go away. So if I speak, I still hurt. If I keep my mouth shut, I still suffer. What's the point? He says, now surely, O God, you have worn me out. So now he's directing his attention up to God. He says, God, you have abused me. You have worn me out. You have devastated my entire household. Now, we might argue that God is innocent in that God did not do that to Job's household. It was Satan, the Ha-Satan, the adversary of Job, that brought about the destruction. But if we go back to chapters 1 and 2, it is God himself who allows Satan to do that. So God is responsible for devastating the entire household of Job. He says, God, you have bound me, and it has become a witness. My life experience is testimony to God's terrifying horrors. He says, my gauntness rises up and testifies against me. God assails me and tears me in his anger. Now, this is a very different approach than what Eliaphz just brought forth to Job. Eliaphz tried to argue that Job's own existence, the reason of Job's suffering, is that he is a wicked, terrible, awful, abominable monster. Job says here, my experiences, the reason I am existing right now, the reason I suffer, does not prove that I am a monster. No, it proves that God is assailing me and tearing me apart in his anger. That God is gnashing his teeth at me. That God is my opponent and he has fastened on me with piercing eyes. Now he returns his focus to his friends in verse 10. He says, men open their mouths and they jeer at me. Who in the story has opened their mouths to jeer at Job? Well, Eliaphz, Bildad, and who's the other one? Zophar. Eliaphz, Bildad, and Zophar. They're the ones that are jeering at Job. They're the ones that are striking his cheek with scorn, that are uniting together against Job. He said, God has turned me over to evil men. Isn't that interesting? Eliaphz just said to Job, Job, you are an evil, wicked man. Job responds, no, the truth is, I have been handed over to wicked men. In other words, Eliaphz, you are a wicked man. God has thrown me into the clutches of the wicked. All was well with me, but God shattered me. God seized me by the neck and crushed me. He has made me his target. His archers surround me. Without pity, he pierces my kidneys and spills my gall on the ground. Again and again, he bursts upon me. He rushes at me like a warrior. To Job, God is nothing more than a brute, bent on his destruction. How many times do you and I feel that way about God? And yet we feel guilt if we express such negative emotions towards God. We are conditioned to believe that God is a loving and just and kind creator. The book of Job shows us a much different approach to our belief in God. Maybe God isn't quite as quote-unquote good, when we're defining good in our own human terms, as we might first believe. Perhaps there is a side of God that is a brute force. A side of God that is bent on destruction. Perhaps we can express such emotion towards God. We're frustrated. We're angry at our situations. We don't understand. We're struggling. We're terrified. We're confused. And we can hold God responsible for the overall truth of the book of Job, which God himself states at the end, is that Job speaks correctly. And Job says that God has seized him. God has crushed him. God has made him a target. God has no pity. God is piercing his kidneys. Now that's a very painful experience, to have your kidneys pierced. It's like a pain undescribable that God is bursting upon him. Job speaks correctly. He goes on and he says, I have sewn sackcloth over my skin and buried my brow in the dust. In other words, I am mourning for my experience. My face is red with weeping, deep shadows ring my eyes, yet my hands have been free from violence. He says, I've not harmed those within my community, within my family. I've not caused harm to my friends like you are doing to me. And I have not done violence like God is doing to me. He goes, my prayer is pure. O earth, do not cover up my blood. May my cry never be laid to rest. Now this is an important moment for Job. Job started out in chapter 3 despising the day that he was born. He wanted to die. He wanted to feel nothing. That's something that, again, I can relate to. That's my Job. That's the Job I can be. There are times where I'm so overwhelmed with stress. I am hurting so bad. All I want to do is crawl under about 8 blankets, turn off the lights, and not exist, not feel anything. Now Job has moved to a point in his argument, in his life experience, where he no longer wants that. He doesn't want to feel nothing. He doesn't want to die. He wants justice. He wants to know and feel something important. He wants a purpose, and that purpose is to hold God accountable for justice. He says, don't let me die. Don't let my cry for justice turn to nothingness. And in verse 19, chapter 6, verse 19, circle it, highlight it, underline it, star it, whatever. This here is Job's second transformation of faith. He says, even now my witness is in heaven, my advocate on high. Job's first transformation was to imagine that maybe somebody could speak on his behalf. At that point, he didn't believe there was somebody, but he began to imagine maybe there could be. Now, because he could start imagining it, now he believes it. There is somebody who is seeing what God is doing to me, and somebody who can testify what's going on. He says, verse 20, my intercessor is my friend as my eyes pour out tears to God. This intercessor is not human. It's not God. But this intercessor has access to God's heavenly court. Just as the other angels in chapters 1 and 2, we are told, had access to the throne of God. Just as Ha-Satan had access to the throne of God. Job says there has to be a witness watching all that is happening. A witness in heaven who has access to God and will not be destroyed by God's own presence, as I would. Who can be my friend? That's my Job. That's the Job I want to be. There's someone in heaven who is my advocate, who is my friend. Job, at this point in the story, does not know who his advocate is, who his intercessor, his friend is. We, as Christians, know who that is. That is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the one who took our place on the cross, the one who was the firstborn raised from the dead, who made his way into heaven to sit at the right hand of God so that we could have access to the throne of God. We know that's Jesus Christ. Job hasn't realized who his intercessor, his advocate, his friend is on high, but he now believes there is someone on behalf who could plead his case to God as a man pleads for his friend. He goes on, he says, only a few years will pass before I go on the journey of no return. He says, my time is limited. I only have a little bit left before I die. And my spirit is broken, and my days are cut short, and the grave awaits me. Continuing in chapter 17, he adds to his argument against Eliaphz. He says, verse 2, surely mockers surround me. The mockers are Job's friends, and my eyes must dwell on their hostility towards me. So now he prays to God. And notice, remember, what he said before, my prayer is pure. He says, give me, O God, the pledge you demand. Who else will put up security for me? You have closed their minds to understanding. Therefore, you will not let them triumph. Whose prayer does God answer? Think about this. Whose prayer does God answer? Does God answer Eliaphz's prayer? Or Bildad's or Zophar's? Or does God answer Job's prayer? Job's prayer is for God to close up their minds of understanding and to not let his three friends triumph. If you want the answer to whose prayer God answers, check out Job chapter 42, verses 7 and 8. Job continues with verse 6. He says, God has made me a byword to everyone, a man in whose face people spit. My eyes have grown dim with grief. My whole frame is but a shadow. Upright men are appalled at this. The innocent are aroused against the ungodly. Nevertheless, the righteous will hold to their ways, and those with clean hands will grow stronger. Job says that he has become an example in which both the ungodly and the righteous can identify. Now that is awesome. That's my Job. An example which other people can relate to. Whether you are born again, a Holy Ghost sanctified filled Christian, or whether you are part of the unbelieving godless society, you can relate to what Job is going through. He says, the ungodly will see and understand, and the righteous, the true righteous, will be strengthened when they look at my story. Verse 10, he says, but come on, all of you, try again. I will not find a wise man among you. He says to his three friends, keep talking. Keep trying to make your point. Not one of you gets it. He says, my days have passed, my plans are shattered, and so are the desires of my heart. These men turn night into day. In the face of darkness, they say light is near. So basically, Job says, you know, you guys, you're saying good things, really. You're saying things that even today most Christians buy into and believe, including myself. I mean, hey, we all want to believe in the book of Proverbs. God rewards the righteous. God will give us good things when we do good things. And God will punish those who shake their fist at him. He says, but you're applying these proverbs, these teachings, in the wrong setting. You're turning night into day. You're saying light is here when really it's as dark as can be. He says, if the only home I hope for is the grave, if I spread out my bed in darkness, if I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, my mother and my sister, where then is my hope? Again, notice how Job has grown in his faith. Once again, before, Job simply wanted to die. Now he realizes if he dies, there is no hope. And he wants hope. That's my Job. That's the Job I want to be. I want hope in this world, hope in this life, hope in my relationship to God, hope in my relationship with others. Job says, if I go down to the gates of hell, if I die, if I return to where the worms eat the body, who can see any hope for me? Will it go down to the gates of death? Will we descend together into the dust? Will my hope and I die together? At this point in the story, Job believes the answer is yes. But he no longer wants that. He no longer wants to feel nothing. He wants justice. He wants vindication. He wants to be released from the terrors that are opposing him. He wants to feel again something. This is a much different Job than what we started out in chapter 1. God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. No, this is a Job now who says, let there be hope. I don't know who will bring the hope, but someone in heaven is my witness. And because there is someone in heaven to be my advocate, my intercessor, someone who can take my case to God, there is hope. So I don't want to die. Job's transformation will continue as his arguments with his friends will continue to go around in circles. When we next gather together to study the book of Job, starting with chapter 18, now it is Bildad, the second of Job's friends, who will speak up again. And Job, in response, will move to his third stage of transformation. We'll see you next time. God bless.